Hey guys! Tonight imagine stepping into a torchlit temple where the air is heavy with incense, walls shimmer with hieroglyphs, and the sound of chanting priests echoes against cold stone. You see a girl no older than 15 dressed in layers of gold and linen standing beside her pharaoh himself. The ceremony unfolding is not just a coronation or offering to the gods. It is a wedding not to a foreign prince or ambitious general, but to her own father. So if you are into strange and fascinating tales from history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. A practice of pharaohs marrying their own daughters may sound like pure tabloid gossip, but in ancient Egypt it was presented as divine order. The pharaoh was not seen as a man in the everyday sense. He was Horus incarnate, the son of Ra, a living god. To marry his daughter was, at least in their reasoning, not incest but the unbroken circle of divine bloodlines. The girl was not just a daughter, she became the goddess Hathor in flesh, a consort meant to mirror the heavens. The origins of this tradition reach back to the Old Kingdom. The ideology was simple yet chilling. The closer the blood, the stronger the claim. A pharaoh's legitimacy was not secured by conquest alone, but by how pure his lineage appeared to priests and scribes. If the king married a foreign princess, he risked diluting that divine aura. But if he married his sister, or even his own daughter, he reinforced the narrative that his family was not just royal, but literally godlike. You might say this was the ultimate branding strategy, except instead of logos on billboards, they carved it into stone temples for eternity. One famous example comes from Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Amid his religious upheaval, moving Egypt toward the worship of Aten, he married his daughters, likely to consolidate loyalty within a royal house shaken by radical change. Archaeologists still argue whether these unions were symbolic or consummated. Some point to inscriptions, naming daughters as "Beer Great Royal Wives," a title reserved for queens. Others suggest these were ritualistic designations, titles of honor without physical unions. It is a debate that rests between the chisel marks of hieroglyphs and the silence of missing evidence. But here the quirky part. These royal unions weren't hidden scandals. They were staged in the most public ways possible. Still it showed pharaohs embracing their daughters. Inscriptions sang praises of their union, and temples displayed them together under divine symbols. It was propaganda in limestone, telling both the gods and the people that the dynasty was locked tight, unshaken by outsiders. Still, behind all the incense smoke and ceremonial pageantry, one can imagine the unease. Did the young brides feel pride, dread, or simply resignation? Ancient Egyptian records never give us their voices, only their titles. Yet, the very absence of their perspective has become one of the most haunting silences in history. And while Egypt was not unique in practicing royal incest, Ptolemaic later perfected the art of sibling marriage. Was the pharaohs who first tied family blood to cosmic order. For them, incest was not shame, but sacred duty. As one modern historian put it, when gods rule, family trees are less like branches and more like serpent. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we laughed about before? Well, this is another case of Egypt being dazzlingly brilliant and bizarre all at once. It worked. Dynasties held onto power longer than most empires in world history, but the cost of keeping bloodlines so tight would be Ptolemaic produced rulers like Ptolemy Hins, whose nickname was literally Witaiskan, meaning pothead, but exactly the godlike image the old pharaohs had hoped for. Still, the foundational belief that a king could marry his daughter without question set the tone for Egyptian vision of kingship. It was less about the individuals and more about what the union symbolized: eternity, order, the unbroken line of divine authority. And with that idea, the pharaohs built a civilization that still captures our imagination today. The logic behind these pharaonic marriages was simple on the surface, but tangled underneath. A king who claimed divine origin needed a queen who was more than a political ornament. She had to be a reflection of the heavens themselves, and who better, priests argued, than his own daughter, already born of the sacred bloodline, already touched by the gods through her father the body. To outsiders, it reads like the darkest satire of monarchy. To the Egyptians, it was simply maintaining Mahat cosmic balance. Consider Pharaoh Ramses D, often called Ramses the Great. Remember him for colossal statues, endless temples, and over 100 children, but woven into that glittering family tree is a curious fact. He likely married at least two of his daughters. Inscriptions show daughters elevated to the status of great royal wife, a title held by queens, not merely princesses. Historians puzzle over whether these unions were ceremonial alliances or physical marriages, but the point remains. The line between child and consort blurred under the shadow of divine kingship. There is another name worth whispering here. Amenhotep Masali, who ruled Egypt at its golden height in the 14th century BC. He married his daughter Sitamun, crowning her queen when she was still in her teens. Imagine the spectacle. Lavish processions along the Nile, courtiers singing praises, statues unveiled. Yet beneath the gold leaf lay the unease of a father making his child both daughter and wife. Was Sitamun's role purely ritual, a priestess, elevated through marriage to symbolize Hathor herself, or was she trapped in the palace machinery, a pawn for dynastic stability? The debate continues among Egyptologists. Like a riddle half erased by desert winds, the eccentricity of these marriages becomes even clearer when you contrast Egypt with its neighbors. The Hittites, for instance, used royal women for diplomacy, marrying daughters into foreign courts. Mesopotamian kings did the same. Egypt, however, guarded its royal women fiercely, rarely allowing them to marry outside the pharaonic line. The crown legitimacy depended not on alliances abroad, but on the illusion of a god-born, god-sustained family. It was insularity masquerading as eternity. Tricky detail time. In some cases, the Egyptians literally rewrote family trees to justify these arrangements. Priests would claim that the pharaoh was both father and husband to the goddess embodied by his daughter. Papyrus, a family looked less like a lineage and more like a Mobius strip, always folding back on itself, erasing beginnings and ends. It'd be bureaucratic incest, smoothed out with ink and incense. Yet here, and where scholarly debates burn brightest, were these marriages practical tools of governance or the product of genuine religious conviction? Some argue that the pharaohs themselves believed their unions preserved cosmic balance. Others suggest the priesthood engineered the theology, binding kings to a system that made them both indispensable and trapped. Either way, the result was the same: a dynasty that turned inward, chasing its own reflection until the mirror cracked. And while pharaohs could command armies and build pyramids, they could control the biology of inbreeding. Later dynasties, like the Ptolemies, would prove the dangers more starkly, with rulers so unstable they turned palace halls into blood-soaked theatres of paranoia. Egyptian divine marriages were less grotesque in medical outcome, but equally heavy in symbolism. The message was clear: loyalty to the throne meant loyalty to a bloodline no outsider could touch. Picture the palaces again, camelays painted with lotus and papyrus, courtyards shimmering with pools of water. In one chamber, a father places a crown on his daughter's head, not as her father, but as her god and husband. Outside, ordinary Egyptians toil in the fields, exchanging gossip over bread and beer. Did they whisper doubts, or did they accept the royal family as being so removed from human norms that such unions seemed untouchable? The silence of the commoners is as haunting as the silence of the princess brides. And yet, in that silence, history still breathes. We can almost hear the tension between power and piety, ritual and reality, devotion and dread. Egyptian kings may have ruled like gods, but they loved, married, and procreated within cages of their own making. Golden cages, yes, but cages all the same. By the time the new kingdom matured, this pattern of fathers marrying daughters had become less an aberration and more a custom etched into royal ritual. The reign of Akhenaten offers one of the most dramatic examples, wrapped in both religious revolution and familial entanglement. Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who abandoned Egypt, dinned traditional gods for the worship of Aten, also blurred boundaries inside his palace walls. He elevated his daughters to positions of striking visibility, showing them in temple reliefs beside him and his queen, Nefertiti. Some scholars argue that one daughter, Meritaten, may have been married to him after Nefertiti disappeared from the records. The imagery is ambiguous. Was it ritual partnership in service of Aten, or did it reflect the same dynastic instinct that had driven Amenhotep Marxley before him? We don't know for certain, but the possibility itself reveals how entrenched the idea had become. When religion shifted, the marriage system bent along with it. Pati the Egyptians, the king was not just a man but the living Horus. Every act of his body rippled into the cosmic order. That included his sex life. Marrying his daughter could therefore be justified as uniting the divine cycle within a closed circle. Father as god, daughter as goddess. their union restoring eternity itself. This theology was intoxicating, and it insulated the palace from outside intrusion. No rival prince could claim legitimacy if all the pharaoh wives were his own children. But let's pause here and slip in a quacky tidbit. Archaeologists discovered tiny ceremonial beds buried with princesses from this era, carved from ivory and inlaid with gold. Were these symbols of royal marriage, or simple toys? Either way, they blur the line between childhood and adult roles in a court where a girl could wake up as a daughter and go to bed as a queen. One wonders what whisper jokes or quiet rebellions might have slipped through the palace walls, servants giggling that the royal family tree looked more like a tangled vine. The wider Egyptian world, however, kept spinning. Farmers ploughed, scribes recorded taxes, soldiers patrolled the borders. For them, the royal family remained distant figures, their divine dramas staged in stone and ceremony. Did anyone outside the court truly care about these marriages? Or did they simply see the king and his bride at festivals, cloaked in gold and incense? Too dazzling to question that silence is haunting, because it leaves us only with fragments, hieroglyphs, papyri, statues, and tomb walls, each a puzzle piece of lives we can fully touch. The debate among historians still sparks with heat. Were these unions fully consummated or symbolic priestly rituals? Some argue the titles of great royal wife imply real marriage in every sense. Others suggest that while the title gave political legitimacy, the relationship stopped at ritual. The truth might be lost in the desert sands, but the consequences were real enough. Dynasties held together by inward-faking marriages, while external alliances languished. It would be worth noticing what Egypt lost by locking its daughters inside. No foreign princesses carried pharaonic blood into other courts, and no Egyptian princesses brought new alliances into Egypt. The result was both strength and fragility, an image of divine purity on the inside and isolation on the outside. The irony is sharp. Pharaohs who controlled empires stretching thousands of miles also lived inside a cage of their own bloodline. Imagine the scene at Thebes. A princess draped in linen so fine it was nearly transparent sits beside her father in a temple, incense thick in the air. The priests chant hymns to Aten, to Amun, to Horus, depending on the century. The court records it as a marriage, a union of god and goddess, but inside her head, silence perhaps, or fear, or maybe the resigned understanding that she was never her own person, only ever an extension of her father divinity. That's in the tragedy of it all. The grandeur is undeniable, but the human cost is written in those gaps where a woman's voice should be. And through those gaps, history whispers not just of power, but of sacrifice. Sacrifice is made in the name of eternity, carved into the very bones of the royal household. The Ptolemaic dynasty, that Greek family who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great conquest, took this tradition of royal incest and pushed it into theatrical overdrive. They were not native Egyptians, but they quickly adopted pharaonic customs to legitimize their reign. And of all those customs, the one they clung to most tightly was the marriage of brother to sister, father to daughter. In fact, it became their dynasty trademark, a political performance staged with full confidence that the world would watch and be awed, horrified. Ptolemy, one of the earliest rulers in this line, married his full sister, Arsinoe Hoji. Greek writers back in the Mediterranean was scandalized, calling it barbaric and unnatural. But within Egypt, the marriage fit neatly into the older pharaonic model. The king became Zeus, his sister wife became Hera, and together they embodied both the gods of Greece and the divine pairing of Osiris and Isis. In a way, the Ptolemies doubled down on incest, fusing two religious traditions to make their power look invincible. And of course, no discussion of this dynasty can skip Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Egypt, whose lovers were Roman, Caesar and Antony, but whose marriages were Egyptian, contracted with her brothers Ptolemy Tiggs and Cyprian. These unions are often portrayed as footnotes, overshadowed by her charisma with Roman greatest men. But within Alexandria they mattered deeply, because they continued the ritual of keeping the royal line sealed. Or from outsiders, the irony is sharp. Cleopatra, who played politics with the most powerful empire in the world, was also trapped in the same cage of blood that had ensnared her ancestors. Let us not forget the human cost. Skeletal remains from Ptolemaic mummies suggest deformities, fragile bones, and stunted growth, possible markers of inbreeding. One papyrus even records a court physician advising special diets and treatments for weak princes. It is chilling to imagine a palace full of golden statues and marble halls, yet behind the curtains, heirs too frail to even stand in the shadow of their thrones. The scholarly debate here revolves around sincerity. Did the Ptolemies really believe in the divine mandate of incest, or was it purely a propaganda tool? Some argue that their Greek roots meant they knew full well how controversial it was, and used it precisely for its shock value, a way of declaring, "We are not just kings, we are gods above your moralic." Others suggest that after generations in Egypt, the line between strategy and belief blurred, until the siblings may have truly seen themselves as sacred couples destined for eternity. There, also, a quirky detail worth pausing on. Coins minted during the reign of Ptolemy T and Arsinoe T actually depict them side by side, styled as divine twins. Imagine pulling out change to buy bread and seeing your king and his sister staring back at you wearing matching crowns. It was both a reminder and a warning. You were ruled by a family so exclusive that no outsider could ever join it. Even money carried the message. Picture Alexandria in its prime. Marble colonnades, the lighthouse blazing across the harbour, scholars scribbling in the great library, and inside the palace, a wedding feast where bride and groom share not only a throne, but a father and mother. The guests applaud, the priests chant, and somewhere, maybe in the corner, a Greek merchant rolls his eyes and mutters, "But only in Egypt." What strikes hardest is how this practice transformed from a secretive ritual into a public spectacle. By the Ptolemaic era, incest wasn't just tolerated, was advertised. It became part of the dynasty identity, carved on temples, sung in hymns, and etched into coinage. Yet beneath all that pomp lurked the same fragile truth that had haunted earlier pharaohs. By keeping their bloodline pure, they may also have doomed it to extinction. By the twilight of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the costs of this strategy were painfully obvious. Cleopatra's 7 siblings were not just rivals. They were fragile, unhealthy young royals who spent as much time battling one another as they did ruling Ptolemy Tings, her brother husband, drowned in the Nile during a war against Julius Caesar's forces. His reign cut short, not by divine justice, but by political chaos and his own inexperience. Another brother, Ptolemy Find, died under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned. Many historians point a finger at Cleopatra herself. The dynasty, so obsessed with keeping power inside, found itself devoured from within, and yet Cleopatra still carried the torch of the old tradition. Her marriages to her brothers were ceremonial, yes, but they sent a message to Egypt. The pharaohs would never dilute their blood, even if it meant creating marriages that functioned more as political contracts than as personal unions. In practice, Cleopatra ran real alliances were with Rome, but in the Egyptian imagination she remained part of a sacred couple. That duality, publicly divine, privately pragmatic, captures the strange tension of her reign. As Rome closed and the rituals of royal incest became less about faith and more about desperation, a dynasty that once bragged about being closer to the gods now clung to any thread of legitimacy it could find. Cologne still bore the twin profiles, hymns still echoed in temples, but the empire was slipping away, like sand, through fingers. When Cleopatra, Bren's son, Caesarion, allegedly fathered by Julius Caesar, was declared Benin King of King, it looked like a break from the tradition, outsider blood mixing with the sacred lime. But Rome ended him quickly, and with his death, the dynasty experiment in incestuous continuity died too. The scholarly debate lingers over whether this whole practice should be seen as religious devotion or cynical politics. Was it faith in the divine order, or simply fear of losing power to foreign dynasties? Some point to temple inscriptions that describe the siblings as gods, in human form, language too rich and poetic to be just propaganda. Others argue it was always a smokescreen, a performance to keep subjects in awe while the rulers lived like prisoners of their own blood. One cark, but telling detail is that even Roman writers who loved to mock Egypt for its strangeness could look away. They sneered at Cleopatra, marriages to her brothers, while simultaneously being fascinated by her charm, her intellect, her ability to bend men like Caesar and Antony to her will. It bit almost as if the shock of incest was part of the theatre, designed to make Egypt unforgettable in the Roman imagination, and it worked. Here we are 2,000 years later still talking about it. So what do we take from this long story of pharaohs and their daughters, brothers and sisters? It is not simply grotesque gossip, though it often reads like it. It is a story about power and the extraordinary lengths rulers will go to preserve it. It is about human bodies turned into symbols, women reduced to wombs, men crippled by their own fragile lineage. It is about how belief and fear can blur until even the most shocking practices are seen as natural, neast by those inside the palace walls. When the dynasty finally fell to Rome, it was not only an empire that ended, but also a ritual. No more pharaohs marrying daughters or sisters. The world moved on, but the echo of those choices lingers in our fascination, in the relief that history can sometimes teach us what not to repeat, and perhaps in the quiet, we can almost hear Cleopatra's last sigh, not just for Antony or for Egypt, but for a family line that had chained itself to an impossible ideal.